Tonight's program is Iran and the U.S. Reviving the Grand Bargain, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. Richard Silverstein will speak on the 2003 Grand Bargain, how it might include resolving the Syria issue, and also the dangerous forces in both Tehran, the hardline Islamists, and Washington, the lobby, the GOP, the Tea Party, and the neocons that will try to torpedo such a deal. Since 2003, Richard's been writing the Tikkun Olam blog about Israelis' national security issues and protecting Israeli democracy. He's concerned with Jewish-Muslim relations and has studied in Israel and brings the Hebrew language, Israeli press, and national security secrets to his blog audience. Jim Eachus will connect the dots by introducing lesser-known but important issues and players in the chemical weapons controversy. He's a retired software developer with a PhD in physics and is an activist with a focus on climate change. Dick Blakney will address the history and characteristics of Syria. He worked mainly overseas for 30 years in health-related areas, including establishing several hospitals and pharmaceutical supply systems for ministries of health in developing countries. He's an activist whose attention is on preventing wars. He has been issuing an Iran update for about 7 years and is dedicated to resolving the perceived differences with Iran through diplomacy. Let's give a warm welcome to our panel.
So it's good to be here again. I think it was about a year ago that Richard and I were here, and at that point we spoke on Iran. But with the Syria issue also being of crisis proportions, we want to start with Iran. Now, I'm sorry, we want to start with Syria. And so last time I gave some characteristics of Iran, and I won't repeat those, but I will give characteristics of Syria. I will only give a few points about the history of Syria, and that's because it's a very long history. And since approximately 10,000 BC, or before the Common Era, Syria was one of the centers of culture, where agriculture and cattle breeding appeared for the first time in the world. It was successively conquered and occupied by many different groups. And it was a very bloody history that I expect many of you may have some familiarity with it. In the year 1516, and I will talk about this map in a few minutes. In the year 1516, it's significant that the Ottoman Empire invaded the Sultanate of Egypt and conquered Syria and incorporating it into their empire. Then in 1918, there was the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and Syria went for French occupation in 1918. 2 years later, the Arab Kingdom of Syria was proclaimed, and then in 1924, the state of Syria was established under a French mandate. Then in 1930, the Syrian Republic was established by a merger of the states of Jabal, Druze, the Alawites, and Syria itself. And then finally, in 1946, Syria gained independence from France. And by the way, if anyone can't hear, just raise your hand and I'll increase the decibels or hold the mic closer. 1956, it's a year that I remember particularly because I went through the Suez Canal on my way to Borneo, actually. But it is at that year, it's on that year, that the Suez Canal was closed. And as a direct result of that Suez crisis, Syria signed a pact with the Soviet Union. And this gave a foothold to the communist influence within the government in exchange for military equipment as well as a military port. And I'll point that out. In fact, I can do that, I think, right now. That port is, where'd it go?
Your port that you were talking about, Tartus, this is the
Tartus.
Russian port on the...
Oh, right there. Okay, thank you. In 1970, there was a power struggle, and that culminated in the corrective movement. And it was a bloodless military overthrow that installed Hafez al-Assad as the strongman of the government. And then in 1973, Syria and Egypt, they initiated the Yom Kippur War, and that was against Israel. However, the Israeli Defense Forces reversed that initial Syrian gain and pushed deeper into Syrian territory. In June 2000, Hafez al-Assad died, and his son, Bashar al-Assad, was elected president in an election in which he was, incidentally, the only person running. His election saw the birth of the Damascus Spring and hopes of reform, but by the autumn of 2001, the authorities had suppressed the movement, imprisoning some of the leading intellectuals. The capital of Syria, as I'm sure you know, is Damascus, but the largest city is Aleppo. And Damascus is, here it is right here, okay. Damascus and Aleppo, the largest city, is up there. Interesting about the area of Syria, it is approximately the same as the state of Washington. So you can kind of imagine how large it is with that comparison. The GDP is, the nominal GDP is $2,800 a year per person in the year 2010. I think that one of the most interesting things, though, is about Damascus. It is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. Now, with this map, there are 3 different sections. And first of all, this section that you see colored brown is the area that is occupied by the government of Syria. The area that is the light green is the area that is occupied by the rebels. And of course, when I say the rebels, it's a plural, rebel groups, I guess I should say. But interesting, you see this really much lighter area up above. Do you know who occupies that? Kurds, exactly. Right. So there are those 3 groups, and that's going to be of significance. Later, I suspect Jim may remark something on that. Geographically, a really important feature is the river, the Euphrates River, which is on the eastern part there, and there's the area in between here. You don't see only one city there. It is more or less dry desert area. They do have mountains there. It's a hot climate, but occasionally they even get snow in that mountain. Human rights has long been a significant concern among independent organizations such as Human Rights Watch, which in 2010 referred to the country's record as among the worst in the world. It's characterized by arbitrary detention, torture, and disappearances are widespread. It also grants leniency for the so-called honor killing. As of November 2011, during the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad, the United Nations reported that even at that point, there were 3,500 total deaths. Over 250 of them were children as young as 2 years old, and that boys as young as 11 had been gang raped by security services officers. Ensuring national security and increasing influence among its Arab neighbors and securing the return of the Golan Heights are the primary foreign policy objectives. The ethnic groups are Syrian Arabs together with Palestinian Arabs, and they make up over 90% of the population. Many of you will be aware of the large number of Iraqi refugees there. At one point, I think it was 2 million. The latest that I had seen, it was down to about 1.3 that still live in Syria as of 2007. Arts, the literature of Syria has contributed to the Arab literature and has a proud tradition of oral and written poetry. I think you'll be aware that about 60% of the population are Sunni Muslims, 12% Alawites, which of course is Bashar al-Assad's religion, Christianity about 10%, and others about 18%. Sports, the most popular sports are soccer and tennis and basketball. But education is free and is compulsory from the ages of 6 to 12. The literacy rate of Syrians age 15 and older is 90.7%, and I find that surprising and impressive. And it's about 82% for females. I suppose not that surprising. Health, in the year 2010, spending for health amounted to 3.4% of the country's GDP, and the life expectancy was 75.7, which also is very impressive. I want to take a minute to comment on the role of the United Nations in countries such as Syria. You'll be aware, I hope, that Article 1 of the UN Charter, and I have a copy of it with me here, but it states the purpose of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, etc. And you probably have heard of Chapter 7. How many of you have heard about Chapter 7? I heard about it recently on NPR. Chapter 7 is action with respect to threats to peace, breaches of peace, and acts of aggression. Now, in the UN Charter, it goes step-by-step articles, but they're in different chapters. But Article 39 says, the Security Council shall determine the existence of any threat to peace, breach of peace, or act of aggression, and shall make recommendations or decide what measures shall be taken in accordance with Articles 41 and 42 to maintain or restore international peace and security. Now, Article 41, it covers measures not involving the use of armed forces, such as complete or partial interruption of economic relations. That's sanctions. Article 42, however, says, should the Security Council consider that measures provided for in Article 41 would be inadequate or have proved to be inadequate, it may take such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. And so Chapter 7 action has been taken by the Security Council relative to that. And so at this point, I'll turn things over to Jim.
Question about geography?
Yes. Oh, I forgot, yes.
Here's the border.
On top, that is to the north, is Turkey, okay? And to the east, then, that goes all the way from here to this border right here is Iraq. Going on to the south, then, is Jordan. And a little farther on, you see a little bit of Israel, and then you see Lebanon right here. And so it's interesting that it's this one is pretty much under government control, and this one, as I had said, is where the rebels are. And we'll be concerned about that as time goes on. Bert, yeah.
How many people live in Syria?
In 1960, it was 4,565,000. In 2011, it had grown to 21 million. So a very rapid increase. I don't know what the population actually in. That has to do the population.
And you cited these actions, both non-military and military, that could apply under Chapter 41.
Chapter 7.
Chapter 7 applies to 41, which is to keep international peace.
Article 41 within Chapter 7, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But anyway, this is a civil war. What does it have to do with international peace? So I don't understand what...
Yes, I think it is a point, because it does say when there is an international problem. But it is, in Syria, it is considered to have international implications because of the implications to the countries all surrounding it. Any other? Yes, Mary Margaret.
Sense of the population between the brown and the green?
I don't. But I had expected that by far the majority of the population live where all of these villages in, but I have read that in this area, which is more fertile, there's a larger population, but I can't state that with absolute certainty. Yes.
I want to talk about the process that led up to the current agreement concerning Syria's chemical weapons and their commitment to turn over and eliminate their chemical weapons. I'll review that process in some detail and try to offer you a very different interpretation of it from the one that is generally accepted and that you've heard. But before I get into that, I want to make a couple of comments on the American empire. Probably 3/4 of Americans don't know that America has an empire. But if by some means they discovered it, a large majority of them would be opposed to the idea. And that unpopularity of the concept imposes a couple of interesting constraints on the American empire. One is that when the American empire needs to do some of the things that empires do, it can't name them as such. What do empires do? Well, they pacify restive provinces. They replace uncooperative provincial governors. Sometimes they go to war with competing empires. America doesn't do those things. We engage in humanitarian intervention, regime change, defending American freedoms, propagation of democracy around the world. Now, another feature of the American empire that I think in a way is again a consequence of the unpopularity of the concept is that there is no single person or agency who makes decisions on behalf of the empire. It consists of a lot of moving parts. We all have our favorite villains, the banking cabal, the military-industrial complex, the national security establishment, the CIA and the NSA, or the corporate empire from Coca-Cola to Monsanto. the president and Congress. Each of these pieces, each of these components of the empire has its own interests, and no one of them has control over all of the other parts of the empire. And when the empire makes a decision, it's not the result of a logical process or even an open debate. It's the result of the balance of power between these different components and their different interests. Okay, with that background about the empire, I'd like to get into the chemical weapons negotiation process. The public events that led up to the current chemical weapons agreement are pretty well known. In August of 2012, Obama made a remark that use of chemical weapons in Syria would be a red line that, if crossed, would compel us to intervene. Over the subsequent months, there were occasional minor chemical weapons incidents, but then on August 21st, a year and a day after that remark, there was a major chemical weapons attack in Syria. The hawks had been grumbling that he ought to do something, and when this major attack happened, they swung into full throat and full voice, demanding that our credibility is at stake, the president must intervene in Syria. And so over the next several days, there was talk of bombing Syria. Some military intervention would take place, and much debate about what it would be. The president tried to put together some kind of a coalition so that we weren't doing this just totally alone. But the hardliners had the upper hand, and but things didn't go very well for the coalition building. The British Parliament voted against participation. The French government declined to participate. He tried to get a Security Council resolution supporting it, and the Russians vetoed that. And then Putin wrote a piece in the New York Times in which he pointed out that an American attack on Syria would be totally illegal under international law. Under international law, you can strike back militarily if you are attacked, or you can proceed, as Dick said, under Article 42, if the Security Council authorizes military action. We weren't attacked. The Security Council could not authorize action because of the Russian veto. And so on August 31st, the president stunned everybody by announcing that he was going to ask for congressional authorization for the attack, which you can think about whether that makes it legal or not, but at least it would make it legal under American law, I guess. It didn't look very good. There was very strong popular opposition to this proposed military action. Congress went into full dithering, and to my surprise, I think to your surprise, it looked like Congress was perhaps not going to approve that authorization. And then on September 9, Secretary of State John Kerry appeared in a press conference in London, and in response to a question, he said, well, yes, there is something Syria could do to avoid an American attack. They could turn all their chemical weapons over to an international agency. But of course, in a week, he said. But of course, they can't and won't do that. But before the day was over, Russia and Syria had both popped up and said, yes, we can do that. We will do that. We think that's a good idea. So that's the public timeline that led us to where we are today. Everybody said, oh, they won't do that. But they did. And so far, Syria is cooperating, and the removal of their chemical weapons is proceeding, as far as we know, moving along okay. Now, I think there's more to this story. And I'm going to start by telling you about three individuals who are very little known, unknown, but had a significant role here. And after I've told you their stories, I'll come back and go through this timeline again with a little different perspective. The first individual is Dennis McDonough. Does anybody know who Dennis McDonough is? Okay. Chief of Staff, very good. President Obama's Chief of Staff. He's a Latin American specialist, fluent in Spanish, lived in Latin America, taught school in Belize for a while. He held several national security positions, earned Obama's confidence, and recently became Obama's Chief of Staff. The August 31st announcement of congressional authorization, according to President Obama, was an idea that he, Obama, came up with during a stroll with McDonough around the White House grounds on August 30th. As you know, Pope Francis is from Argentina. A Spanish language newspaper in Argentina speculated that McDonough, who is a Catholic, had been influenced by the Pope's strong call for a negotiated settlement in Syria. But in fact, McDonough had been on record for quite a long time as being very concerned about the slippery slope of American involvement in Syria. The second individual who's even more obscure is Job Price. Does anybody know who Job Price is, or was, I should say? He's dead now. Dick knows because he's heard this story before. Job Price was the commander of a Navy SEAL unit. In December 2012, he was reported to have died of non-combat injuries, and it was said that it was being investigated as a possible suicide. He left behind a wife, a child, a promising military career, and no known major problems. So suicide didn't really seem very plausible. Also in December of 2012, Hillary Clinton was reported to have had the flu, dehydration, dizziness, a fall, and concussion, and ended up in the hospital. Any connection between these two? Not seemingly, but there was a report in the European Union Times that the two were very much connected. According to the story in the European Union Times, the Navy SEAL unit had the responsibility of providing security for American diplomats traveling in war zones. And according to this story, Secretary Clinton was on a plane that left Bahrain with her Navy SEAL security unit on a flight plan to Baghdad. But shortly after takeoff, the plane diverted and went to Ahvaz, Iran. Upon landing in Iran, it encountered severe turbulence and crashed off the runway, killing some on board and injuring others. Job Price in the security detail was killed. Secretary Clinton was badly injured, and the next day was flown to New York to a hospital. Now, I can't find any independent confirmation of that story. The European Union Times said it came from a Russian intelligence report and Israeli sources. You can buy it or not, but it does seem to me shed some interesting light on the thing. Secret diplomacy with Iran is not unprecedented. Trita Parsi says that in the 1970s, Yitzhak Rabin traveled to Tehran wearing a wig. Third person of interest is Margaret Brennan. And somebody here must know who Margaret Brennan is. She's the best known of the three. Margaret Brennan is CBS's State Department correspondent. When Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she traveled with Hillary routinely. And now that John Kerry is Secretary of State, she routinely travels with John Kerry. In September of 2012, she interviewed Hillary Clinton while they were in Vladivostok, Russia. And during that interview, Hillary said, the Russians are concerned about Syria's chemical weapons, that they might fall into the wrong hands. And she said, yes, we are working with other countries on that question. Countries, plural. In September of 2013, September 9th, John Kerry had this press conference in London where he was asked, is there anything that Syria could do to avoid an American attack? Now, as soon as I heard about that, my thought was that question planted? But then I thought, well, the news conference was in London. How could he have planted a question with British correspondents? Well, it wasn't a British correspondent that asked the question. It was Margaret Brennan, who'd been traveling with him. So I believe the question was planted. The answer was intended. Okay, with those three stories in mind, let's move ahead to a different timeline here. Sometime in 2012, negotiations had already begun among the US, Russia, and other powers about Syria's chemical weapons. Hillary Clinton said that effectively in her interview with Margaret Brennan. On August 20th, Obama made his red line remark. That wasn't an offhand remark. It was a perhaps clumsy attempt to put some pressure on those negotiations and get them to move ahead a little faster. Continued in September, we had this Clinton-Brennan interview in Vladivostok where Hillary said there have been negotiations going on about this. She said countries, plural, which means Russia and Syria and maybe Iran. I don't think you can make a deal about Syria without including Iran. If Syria has any bigger backer than Russia, it's Iran. Negotiations are interrupted by Clinton's plane crash in December. And then on August 21st, we have the major chemical weapons attack. The hawks and hardliners get the upper hand using the credibility argument. The president can't say, well, I said it, but I didn't mean it. He has to do something. And then we have the problems he encounters in trying to build support for the attack, but he still has to do it, whether there's support or not. August 30th, we have the stroll on the White House grounds with Obama and McDonough. Now, what were they talking about? Well, first of all, why did they have this conversation on the White House grounds rather than sitting in somebody's office? The walls have ears. Now, maybe the White House grounds are bugged too, I don't know. But the question they're asking themselves and each other is, how can we buy some time so that these negotiations can be wrapped up so that we don't have to bomb Syria? And then the light bulb comes on. You want to delay? Congress. What do they know how to do? Delay. They weren't even in session when he made the request. So they gradually come back into session. They dither and dither, and he gets his delay. September 5 and 6 was the G20 meeting in St. Petersburg. And Obama said afterwards in an interview, well, yes, I did talk with Putin about the chemical weapons, and well, yes, that was a continuation of earlier conversations we'd had about it. So he said, negotiations have been going on. And what really happened in that meeting? Obama grabbed Putin by the arm and said, look, we have to wrap up these negotiations about chemical weapons, otherwise I'm going to have to bomb Syria, and you aren't going to like that any more than I do. And Putin said, okay, I understand. So on September 9, we have Kerry responding to a planted question from Margaret Brennan, saying, is there anything Syria could do? Well, yes, they could turn over their chemical weapons, but they can't and won't. Before the day was over, Russia and Syria had jumped up and said, yes, governments don't make decisions in hours. They need days, they need to talk, they need to get people together, they need to exchange opinions. Two governments both had to agree on this before either of them could speak. They had to be prepped and ready for that question. So they were prepped, they were ready, and that was it. And the rest is history, if we could call it history. The rest is secrets, whatever. I looked for a historical parallel to this, and one that I found that I think is interesting is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy and Khrushchev brought the world to the brink of catastrophe and then managed to pull back through secret negotiations that enabled them, both of them, to claim victory. And that's what happened here. Another historical parallel that I think also is interesting is Mikhail Gorbachev. He saw the weakness of the Soviet Union. He saw that they could not compete with America on hard power, and he tried to convert the Soviet Union to soft power. And that's what I see Obama doing now, trying to convert America from hard power to soft power. And there are hawks. There were hawks in Russia, there are hawks in America that don't want to see that change. But I believe that this is an example of Obama's attempt to convert America from hard power to soft power. His definition of soft power is not one I like very well, but it's different. So I'll turn it over to Richard now. Do you want to have some Q&A at this point?
I don't understand hard and soft power.
Hard power is aircraft carriers and armies and big bombs and big rockets. Soft power, Hillary Clinton, more than anybody else, is associated with the phrase soft power. Soft power is diplomacy, arm twisting, threats, but not carrying them out. When I say I don't like his definition of soft power, I think that Obama's definition of soft power includes drones and kidnappings and cyber warfare. These are things that don't require the resources of aircraft carriers and armies, and that's why I think he sees them as soft power. But they do have the same danger of blowback that hard power has, and that's the part that he seems to be overlooking. Todd?
Yeah, three questions. During this first week of September, when the decision was actually being made whether to invade, or to bomb Syria, many of us were active on Facebook and other discussions, and one of the prominent conclusions people had was that the war had been stopped mainly because of congressional Republicans. Because when they came up to informal nose counts of who's going to authorize the attack, most of the people who were voting no were actually Republicans. So and then along come Ray McGovern on Thursday. He made quite a strong statement for several minutes that General Dempsey had stopped the invasion by his position that made his public statements that it wasn't an imminent threat or necessary or time sensitive that we have to attack Syria right now. So Ray McGovern, he said, General Dempsey is our hero, for keeping us out of another war. So there's another one for you. But I feel that the whole thing really belongs in the context of domestic politics, where much of our description here is international and diplomatic. And for example, the G20 meeting, the newspapers had much the narrative you have that it was about, prominent discussion was about whether to make war in Syria. But when Obama went to this meeting, the first people that he met with were the trade negotiators from Japan and other Far East countries to work on TPP. So I think it's even possible that the whole thing is a big smokescreen just to conceal the negotiations for international trade agreements. So that's kind of where
there's truth in everything you say. I've been nervous about all this government shutdown stuff, kind of on the same basis. While everybody's talking about government shutdown, what are these scoundrels doing behind the scenes? And working on international trade agreements is probably part of that. I won't go into the TPP, but that's a pretty interesting subject too. As far as Ray McGovern and General Dempsey, I think General Dempsey was right on track with Obama's desire for a delay. And a delay isn't the same as not doing it, but a delay that gives you time to do something different has real value. And I wouldn't give Dempsey the exclusive credit that Ray McGovern gave him, but he certainly was a supporting actor in that process. Bert?
Ray McGovern, when he was here in town, had a very, I thought, significant statement about Obama. Apparently Obama was in some gathering of progressive, small group of progressive supporters, and they were pressing him, why didn't he adopt a more progressive, liberal policy? And Obama turned to them and said rather sharply, you know what happened to Martin Luther King, don't you? Meaning, according to Ray McGovern, and I can completely believe this if you know the story of Jim Douglas' story of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy too, that Obama is afraid of the CIA and what they might do to him or his family if he turns too far towards peace.
That's an unpleasant aspect of the Gorbachev parallel that I'm reluctant to bring up. But the Gorbachev attempt to convert the Soviet Union from hard power to soft power ended in a coup with Gorbachev's removal from power. Now, in America, we don't have coups, but we do have ways of eliminating uncooperative presidents. So.
There are some people that would say John F. Kennedy was a coup.
Yes, I know that's a very... Yeah.
The Asian Times had a highly speculative article that said that it talked about those cruise missiles, the navigation systems. And there's 3 navigation systems in there. One of them is GPS, and the other 2 depend upon seeing the contours of the land. And they said that they thought that maybe the Syrians had something that they could jam up the GPS stuff. And then also they had missiles where those destroyers couldn't come very close. So those cruise missiles would have to fly over water where there'd be no land recognition. And they thought that possibly that those missiles wouldn't hit their targets, and then they'd have to follow in with bombers and stuff. And Obama didn't want to get into it that deeply. And that's just a speculative article. He had there was no facts to back it up, but an interesting thought.
Well, there's at least one fact to back it up. It's pretty well known that Iran has GPS techniques for jamming GPS systems. And certainly Iran is sharing that technology. You can expect that Iran would be sharing that technology with Syria. So that may be true also. There were a lot of reasons for Obama not to want to do this, despite the pressure.
Iran doesn't share a border with Syria, is that correct? It does not have a border, so...
One country away.
Yeah, so when Iran wants to send any kind of material support to Syria, through which country do they send it? Iraq?
And that's been in the news.
Right.
Denials.
You know, it's fun to analyze all this, but I think I better give Richard a turn here.
Thank you, Jim.